to this webinar on Fratelli Tutti, hosted by the Australian Cardijn Institute and Social Policy Connections. This webinar is a sequel to a webinar on Fratelli Tutti hosted by both organisations on 22nd of October 2020. It was a free-flowing and lengthy discussion with over 100 participants. This presentation will revisit the formal presentations on that day and distill the essentials of the discussions that followed. My name is Brian Lawrence. I'm the President of the Australian Cardijn Institute. The Institute works to promote research, studies and training programs based on the vision and methods pioneered by Cardinal Joseph Cardijn, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement. Social Policy Connections is an ecumenical social advocacy network based in Melbourne. Our guest speakers are from Social Policy Connections. Our first speaker, Father Bruce Duncan, is the Director of Social Policy Connections. For many years, he has taught the history, content and relevance of Catholic social thought at Yarra Theological Union in Melbourne. He is well known across Australia through his many publications on these subjects. Our second speaker, Danusia Kaska, is a board member of Social Policy Connections and is the Social Justice Network Coordinator at Xavier College in Melbourne. Stefan Gigas, the Secretary of the Australian Cardijn Institute, is our webinar controller. I will now hand over to Stefan. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Brian. Today we'll do this in a bit of a question and answer format, and I'll pose a few questions to Bruce along the way. But right now I'd like to hand over directly to Bruce to offer his presentation. Thanks very much, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Brian, and for the opportunity to speak to you today, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a really important topic for it to get across. As we know, it's Pope Francis's second major social encyclical, following up his earlier one, 2015, on Laudato Si on environment, and entitled Fratelli Tutti on Fraternity and Social Friendship. A different emphasis that is coming through in this one. It's a partner to Laudato Si, but it doesn't take up the major issues of Laudato Si on climate change. It presumes he's already said enough on that, and we're all well aware of that, but what he is concerned about now is a new situation with coronavirus having a huge impact around the world and undermining the international economy with the risk of war. So that is his primary concern. And some of the commentators have been disappointed and upset that he's named it Fratelli Tutti because of the gender implications, particularly for the English-speaking world. I understand that in Spain and Italy, Fratelli is understood it to be an inclusive term for men and women, but when you translate it into English, then it doesn't have that connotation. And this is disappointing that they could have easily entitled the document Fraternity and Social Friendship. But anyway, they've kept the words that St. Francis used in one of his talks to his brothers at the time, 800 years ago. But there's another aspect to this we must clear out of the way before we begin. It is that, and this is keenly disappointing from Pope Francis, that he hasn't used any references to women or referred to women scholars or saints who have contributed in this area or any of their writings. And this is so surprising because he's been so strong on women having a full voice in church and society, and yet it's omitted from this document. The only explanation I can think of is that it has been rushed out because he feared of the economic situation and the possibility of war. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this is, I'm surprised that none of his advisors said to him, look, we've got to just to include all the women writers that have contributed in this area, and the scholars and the great advocates in the past. There have been so many. But anyway, it is what it is. So that mustn't distract us, though, from the really substantial issues that this encyclical is dealing with. Because like in Laudato Si', he did not only address the climate issues, but he also addressed the issues of growing inequality in the world, and particularly the extremes of inequality. That wealth is so concentrated in a way we've never seen before, with people having hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth, and the top 1% having more wealth than half the entire rest of the world. You know, this is just astonishing figures. He doesn't go into the economics of this. He's talking to the moral aspects. So he's not using the sort of scientific and economic advice that he used in Laudato Si'. And this is another difficulty with the encyclical, that it's very self-referential, that he uses 172 quotes that he's made of his own talks in various parts of the world in the last 7.5 years, going on 8 years. And the rest of the quotes that he uses, over 100 of them from church documents, previous popes, and some other scholars or notable individuals, but none of them men. So why is this? You know, it's very strange to keep quoting your own material like this. And I think the answer to that is, and one of the commentators said, is the Pope thinking of retiring? It reads like a last will and testament. And is he thinking that we're about to plunge into a big war, or is he ill, or is he going to retire? So it reads like that. It's very easy to read. It's very well expressed in very personable language, as Francis writes like that, but it's puzzling. And the way I look at it is like this. It's as if he's assembled all these little pieces of a mosaic, and they're all individual colors. And as you build a mosaic, you know, you build it up from little colored stones, and you glue them into place, and you develop another picture out of that. And I think that's the way to look at this encyclical, is it's a mosaic of his own reflections on where we are as a planet, and particularly what are the perils that are facing human well-being at this very moment. So
Bruce, many commentators were expecting Fratelli Tutti to expand on the concerns the Pope highlighted in Laudato Si' about climate change and global warming. Yet actually in Fratelli Tutti, he says very little about those issues. How would you explain that?
Yes, well, this is very surprising, isn't it? Because when we heard that he was producing another document, we very much thought it would be in a similar vein and tackle the climate issues very strongly again, as he has done in many of his talks and meetings since. But he allows the climate issues to fall into the background in this document. And I think he particularly wants the concentration. Look, I think it's like this. If you're looking at your TV today, tomorrow, it's full of climate change material. There are reports coming through about the danger, the rising temperatures, and there are lots of really good information. Schools and universities have picked this up very, very quickly. But what they haven't picked up on is the degree of inequality in the world and what we need to do to confront this, and particularly the ideology of neoliberal economics, which assumes that the free market of itself will produce the best outcomes almost automatically. And all firms have to worry about, big businesses, is to get into the marketplace and maximize their profits, and particularly in more recent years, in the short term, emphasis on short term. But what has happened, of course, is there's been a great aggregation of wealth into the hands of the giant corporations, and the hands of a very small elite in various countries. The elite is spread more. We have billionaires in China now and right through different countries. It is not being spread evenly. So this is what he wants to talk about, how we manage the inequality in the context of this great pandemic that we're going through. And particularly there's a sense of frustration and disappointment in his writings because in Laudato Si he was strongly backing the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the promise of channeling world resources into lifting living standards everywhere in the 17 different goals, reducing inequality, eliminating hunger, providing opportunity, education, good healthcare on a universal scale. The first time in history, the most astonishing program on how to do this for the entire world population. But he sees that not just with the pandemic, it is accentuated what was already happening with the growing inequality, that the economic system as it has developed in more recent years is really keeping many more people poor. The other thing about this encyclical is he originally intended it to be an encyclical to the world religions about how human fraternity binds us all together and that all of us are made in God's divine image, and hence everybody, whatever their religion, even if they don't have any religion at all, they're completely atheist, they're still made in God's image, and we need to respect that. And as an indication, and he started writing the encyclical like that. Particularly, he was taking a document he had signed with the Grand Imam of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayeb in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, which is entitled The Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. This is one of the most astonishing documents of modern times and very strongly condemning terrorism in the name of God, and committing each other to recognize and reverence the religious traditions of Christians and Muslims together. Francis wanted to expand this into a more universal declaration among the great religions about committing them to human well-being and doing it peacefully. And just to quote from Fratelli, he says, quoting the document, "By acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration for fraternity between all men and women. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers, sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the riches of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his own voice or her voice, brothers and sisters all." The word fraternity, some of the commentators said this is a gender issue again, using that word fraternity, but it comes out of the context of this dialogue between the Muslim and Christian Pope and the Imam. Fraternity for those two great religions is not seen in gender terms, but it is very deep in their traditions, as indeed it is in all the great world religions, and even in our secular traditions. So you think of French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, it's all, but of course understood today in an inclusive framework. The encyclical begins with the Pope Francis referring to that document, and he refers to it throughout the document about 8 times, his own encyclical about 8 times, it keeps coming back to it. And he closes the encyclical in chapter 8 with a chapter called Religions at the Service of Fraternity. So again, he's incorporating this notion of religions as really putting all their moral support and energy behind this global effort to lift human well-being everywhere. And it says, it denounces violence and hateful attitudes in the name of religion as a terrible distortion. Quote, God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people. So it's a remarkable document that he's appealing to here. And the encyclical ends with two little prayers, one that all believers in a creator can say together of all religions, and another shorter ones explicitly for Christians. So if I could summarize this, what he's doing in the encyclical, he's wanting all the world religions to speak together about how precious every single person is in God's sight, made in God's image, deserving of respect and honour, and that in God's eyes, we are all brothers and sisters, and we need to learn to dialogue and encounter each other, to learn this as an art, a skill, and to see how God leads us in many paths to seek the well-being of everyone, especially those in trouble or distress. And Francis is taking up now that French revolutionary cry, liberty, equality, fraternity. But everybody's talking about in the Western world, liberty, that we don't have, we can see that in the United States, we don't have to talk about that so much. But equality and fraternity, we do have to talk about. And they're going to be the themes of the encyclical.
Bruce, we can recognise the importance of this document on human fraternity signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam, but what would you say about what that means for the rest of the world?
I think what he is doing here is as a religious leader and with the backing of other world religions, calling for urgent action, world action at this very pivotal moment in history, in collaboration with all the great religious traditions, even with people who are not believers, but are committed to human and planetary well-being. He seeks out the common ground for this in a simple compassion and simple humanity, and he locates it in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan as expressing a moment of truth, he calls it, for all believers. And it is this: will we bend down to touch and heal the wounds of others? Are we going to be doing that? And it not only invites us to compassion and personal outreach, but I think it empowers us to bridge differences in search of a common solidarity for everyone. These are his words. He writes, "A journey of peace is possible between religions. Its point of departure must be God's way of seeing things. God does not see with his eyes. God sees with his heart. And God's love is the same for everyone, regardless of religion. Even if they are atheists, his love is the same. When the last day comes and there is sufficient light to see things as they really are, we're going to find ourselves quite surprised." And he was quoting there from the new film Francesco by Wim Wenders, out in 2018. And he had said, paradoxically, even those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. Well, I think we're all seeing that too. So what Francis is doing is inviting people of all goodwill into a process of discernment about how to protect human well-being now and the planet, welfare of the planet at a critical time. So he's talking about a process of doing this, careful reflection on our own experience, evaluating that what's happening around us in the light of the moral values and belief we all hold, and particularly the Good Samaritan captures that. You don't have to be a believer to recognise the moral truth of that parable. And then the third step, determining action to take in response. He wants this to be a process the whole world is involved in, and of course we are involved in various ways, in much more sophisticated ways than he's going to put to us. He uses this method of what See, Judge, Act. Some of you will recognize that from the young Christian workers movements and other groups influenced by Canon Cardijn from the 1920s. He developed it as a method for engaging the experience and reflection and participation of young workers, initially young women workers, but young male workers as well. And it's not just a method of discernment, but it's an empowerment method to give people the confidence and strength and skills to really take the action where in their factories or their workplaces or wherever their situation was. So this See, Judge, Act method is very evident. It underlines Pope Francis, all his main documents, he uses this method. And it's particularly, you'll see it in this document where it begins with the dark shadows of the world. Then he talks about the Good Samaritan, and a very insightful, not preachy, but really working out of his own experience too. I think you will enjoy reading that. And then going on to the 6 chapters about what are we going to do?
Yeah, Bruce, you mentioned Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, the title of his first chapter. Why is Pope Francis so concerned about current events that he drastically changed direction with the new encyclical?
Thank you. Why is he so concerned about current events? Because he can see that the chaos in many countries that is following from the coronavirus, and where you get chaos and a breakdown of resources, food, water, petrol, communications, then you get civil disorder, and you can get civil wars, and we're seeing that in various parts of the world, but also you can see great conflict between countries over resources and poverty. Most especially, what he's concerned about is the great opportunity we have as a human race to eliminate hunger and poverty almost within our lifetimes, or at least the lifetimes of younger people today. And this is an astonishing moment that we can't let slip, but it is slipping. That is his concern. The astonishing gap between rich and poor, and particularly he blames in large part the power of global economic interests who are manipulating the system for their own interest and not for the common good. And you can see instances of this. This is in part why action on climate change is being so slow. It's been held up by coal and fossil fuel industries, even though everybody is clamoring for a really strong action. We see this in Australia. But internationally, also, it means disaggregating wealth and power so that everybody the power of special interest is broken. It doesn't mean chaos. We already have the institutions in the United Nations and other international organizations which can be improved. He says, of course, yes, they need improvement, but we do have the instruments to create a much better and a fairer world, and particularly one that's going to be more sustainable. So he's speaking out of a certain sense of frustration and desperation about the build-up of global tensions, and particularly the arms race is getting underway again, as we know, even in our part of the world, with tensions with China, over Taiwan, clashes here and there. What he must be really afraid of is if there is a full-scale war sparked in any number of places, could happen. And he says at one point, major political crises result in the deaths of millions of children emaciated from poverty and hunger. And we see this in Syria, Yemen, other places and now increasingly in parts of Africa. So in a lament that captures his frustration and presumably referring to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, so he doesn't name them, he writes, "A plan that would set great goals for the development of our entire human family nowadays sounds like madness. The slow and demanding march towards an increasingly united and just world is suffering a new and dramatic setback. Yes, wealth has increased, but so has inequality, causing new forms of poverty." And Francis is afraid that growing anger, widespread anger about the unjust distribution of wealth, resulting in hunger, disease, environmental disasters, look at the environmental disasters happening, will result in increasing violence and disorder, the accelerated arms race, abuse of human rights, and this will tumble easily into a spreading war. He deplores the aggressive nationalism of various ideologies and the dominance of the economic and financial sector, linked with foreign interests and transnational economic powers, imposing a version of globalization, strengthening the powerful at the expense of the weak. He talks about these new forms of cultural colonization have bent words like democracy, freedom, justice, and utility to serve as tools for domination. And how curious now that the Pope is one of the major focus and voices in defense of democracy. He's dismayed at the degradation in politics, where hyperbole, extremism, and polarization have become political tools, using slick marketing techniques to discredit others, and with debate degenerating into, quote, a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. Other issues he picks up, and gladly you'll be here to, he speaks strongly about the situation of women in many societies that do not allow them the same dignity and rights as men. Quote, "Millions of people today, children, women, and men of all ages, are deprived of freedom and forced to live in conditions akin to slavery, sold and reduced to being the property of others. Women are subjugated and forced to abort. Others are kidnapped to sell their organs, and human trafficking is spread worldwide. These situations of violence, sad to say, have become so common as to constitute a real third world war fought piecemeal. And he goes on, "When one part of society exploits all that the world has to offer, acting as if the poor did not exist, there will eventually be consequences. Sooner or later, ignoring the existence and rights of others will erupt in some form of violence, often when least expected. Liberty, equality, and fraternity can remain lofty ideals unless they apply to everyone." Now, some critics have criticised the Pope for what they called hysterical language. But he replies he's speaking as a voice for the exploited and discarded people, not for those living in opulence. And he blames a profit-based economic model that does not hesitate to exploit, discard, and these are his words, even kill human beings. So he is speaking very strongly, but he is speaking from the third world, and he's from the various poorest parts of the third world, parts that he's known and experienced in Argentina himself. He continues that the pandemic has forced us to recover our concern for human beings, for everyone, rather than for the few. We need to rethink our lifestyles and, above all, the meaning of our existence. He says the world is crying out in rebellion against our feverish consumerism. Excuse me. Without an attempt to enter into this way of thinking, what I am saying here will sound wildly unrealistic, he says. We can rise to the challenge, let me rephrase it, we can rise to the challenge of envisaging a new humanity. We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. This is the path of peace, not the senseless and myopic tragedy or strategy of sowing fear and distrust in the face of outside threats. And he says that he appeals to all those who are working for social harmony. They, quote, should never forget that inequality and lack of integral human development make peace impossible.
Bruce, in the US and Europe, some people have been very critical of the Pope's pleas to open borders and to host more refugees and migrants. How does Fratelli Tutti respond to those criticisms?
Well, this is a topic very dear to Pope Francis. As you know, his parents were migrants from Italy to Argentina. So that's part of his story himself. So he is very sensitive to the issue of migrants and refugees. And we know today that each year, in the last few years, some 80 million people have been displaced, most of them internally in their own countries, but many to other countries. So, and we just saw in the news the other day how another dozens, scores more people were drowned crossing the Mediterranean. So he has made this a major issue of his advocacy. And his very first trip out of Rome was down to the island of Lampedusa, down the south of Italy, where they had been receiving lots of refugees from Africa and the Middle East. And many people had died on the way, of course, regrettably. And his altar was made out of the shipwreck of one of these vessels. So this was a dramatic gesture. Part of his approach is, he says, it guides his advocacy. He says, use symbols and speak simply, two of his guiding principles. So when he picks out these symbols, they are meant to be a dramatic gesture, and they certainly were in Lampedusa. And then when he went back to the Greek island of Lesbos in 2016, he brought back with him 12 Muslim refugees to live in the Vatican, at least for a time, until they could be absorbed into it. So he's doing this personally and in urging that the whole world look again. He's appalled at the walls that have been, talks frequently about the walls that have been built and the effect this is having on migrants and refugees. He rejects the view of some regimes that are refusing to accept migrants and refugees at all costs, he says. And this leaving people in acute distress. He said they should not be forced to rely on criminal gangs in order to seek refuge. Unscrupulous traffickers, frequently linked to drugs or arms cartels, exploit the weakness of migrants. They too often experience violence, trafficking, psychological and physical abuse, and untold sufferings on their journey. He's not being overly utopian here, as some of the critics accuse him of, we can't manage this. He says, ideally, unnecessary migration ought to be avoided. He agrees with that. He's not encouraging people to migrate to other countries. He's saying the emphasis should be on helping those countries to manage their own internal difficulties and increase their living standards and life opportunities, food and agriculture in their own countries, so they don't have to do this. But he says, where you have economic collapse and hunger and violence, persecution and war, well, naturally people are going to flee for safety. And we in Australia can empathise with this, can't we? You think of since the Second World War, even since a short time since then, half of our entire population is either a migrant or a child of a migrant. And we have, until our rather harsh recent policies against migrants and holding immigrants in overseas detention policies, we were a light to the world on how to integrate and to, as Pope Francis' words are, to welcome, to protect, to promote and integrate. This is what we had been doing for so long and we've done so well. And he's saying the whole world needs to do this. He realizes that many countries are afraid of migrants, and they're anxious, particularly if they come from Muslim countries, and they're fearing terrorist attacks. And this has been exploited, of course, by some of the populist regimes. But they're only a minority of people, and we need to really welcome people and make them feel at home, give them a home, give them protection. And this is part of our, following in the footsteps of the Good Samaritan.
Bruce, before he was elected Pope, Francis experienced the dirty war in Argentina when the military regime murdered literally thousands of people. How do you think that experience has shaped his views about human rights and the reconciliation processes?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. This is a really good question, because when you're reading the document, particularly when you get to these sections where he's dealing with human rights and torture and abuse, he has come out of a situation like that himself. He's been in Argentina when they had this terrible economic collapse, when half the country was half the workers were unemployed. Many businesses went bankrupt. It was the first biggest sovereign default of a country in history. So he's seen the economic consequences of this, and he's been involved in getting groups together to try to spread food, to share food, to organise to help support people through these difficult periods. So we don't know exactly the numbers of people who were disappeared, put in helicopters, taken out to sea and disposed of that way, but there were tens of thousands. And people were being tortured. And and it went on for 6 years. So it was quite a long period to be trying to struggle. How do you try to slow, as a churchman, and helping to advise other church leaders, how do you respond in this situation to stop the killing and to really know what's going on? And he himself was involved in smuggling people out of Argentina. His chemistry teacher, where he was in a chemical factory, he smuggled her and her daughter in his little car, drove them to the border and smuggled them across, and then came back himself when they were safe. This chemistry teacher was a communist, by the way, but he admired her greatly, not because of a communist ideology, but because of a commitment to looking after people and to care for human rights and so on. Now, she once her daughter was safe, she came back to Argentina, and she was picked up. She was tortured, and she was eventually taken in one of these helicopters and dropped out to sea. I think they found later her body somewhere. So this is not something academic. And Bergoglio, as he was at the time, some of his other close friends were also murdered. So this is a context of trying to work their way out of his situation. So he's particularly after the Falklands War, as you know, the military regime lost that war, and then the regime was collapsed, and they returned to democracy again. But then begins a long, slow process of bringing healing and reconciliation to the country. So when he's writing in this document now about healing and reconciliation and victims of torture, he's writing with a real passion and conviction about these things. And I think you'll find that really quite moving. He writes, "Pain and conflict transform us. We no longer have any use for empty diplomacy, hidden agendas, or good manners that mask reality. Those who were fierce enemies have to speak from the stark and clear truth. They have to learn how to cultivate a penitential memory, one that can accept the past in order not to cloud the future with their own regrets, problems, and plans." He says, every peace process is an effort to seek truth and justice, to honour the memory of victims, and to open the way step by step to a shared hope stronger than the desire for vengeance. So he's saying there's no easy way to reconciliation. He says genuine reconciliation does not mean simply forgetting injustice. Forgetting is never the answer, he writes. Francis continues that a true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of a power that he does not know how to use and diminishes his own humanity. Forgiveness does not entail letting criminals continue their wrongdoing. The important thing is not to fuel anger, which is unhealthy for everyone, and not to become obsessed with taking vengeance and destroying the other. So he speaks of how countries are trying to come to terms with past conflicts, and many countries he's been to visit. He's made 30 overseas trips, as you know, and been to several countries at a time, and often into conflicted situations where he's trying to talk about how you bring reconciliation. He says, he's not trying to cover anything up here. He says, if conflicts are kept hidden or buried in the past, silence can lead to complicity in grave misdeeds and sins. Authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict, resolving it through dialogue, open and honest, patient negotiation. So, and then he goes on to mention some of the other great conflicts. He mentions the Shoah, of course, and the murder of the 6 million Jews by the Nazis. He calls it the enduring symbol of the depths to which human evil can sink when spurred by false ideologies. But he also mentions the horror of the atomic bombs in Japan and the threats from weapons today. And then he continues, neither must we forget the persecutions, the slave trade, and the ethnic killings that continue in various countries, as well as many other historical events that make us ashamed of our humanity. They need to be remembered always and ever anew. And what he's talking about here, of course, includes the conquesta of Latin America and all the massive killing of the indigenous peoples over the next century, where 90% or more of them died. A lot from disease as well, but you know, the treatment of the indigenous peoples all around the world and this colonizing wave is and the slave trade, of course, such a huge influence in Latin America as well as Africa itself. He says these must never be forgotten. For God's sake, no, we can never move forward without remembering the past. We do not progress without an honest and unclouded memory. We need to keep alive the flame of collective conscience, bearing witness to succeeding generations to the horror of what happened. So in Australia, I think we're still on this journey too, aren't we? A reconciliation of Indigenous peoples and throughout the Pacific and this part of the world, Asia Pacific too. We all have the need to continue this dialogue, the truth-telling. We're still in the process of finding out the truth and taking these steps to reconciliation. However, in the Fratelli Tutti, he only makes passing reference to the Indigenous peoples, even though, of course, he's just had the big Amazon Synod, where he did speak at length about his reflections on that Synod. So just to conclude this section, he says, intolerance and lack of response to Indigenous popular cultures is another form of violence against them. So we really have still a lot of work to do to recognise the gift that Indigenous people are to us, and particularly in this country.
Bruce, Pope Francis has been criticised as being allegedly naive in rejecting traditional just war criteria that allowed for a war of defence against an unjust aggressor. Do you think this is a valid criticism of Pope Francis' views?
Yes, that's a view that's been taken by some critics, particularly from the right wing or political wing. I don't think it's a fair criticism. Certainly, Pope Francis is making a very strong statement about the threat of war and the impact of new wars today because of the massive, particularly nuclear weapons, but also there's a huge range of new weapons coming onto the market, far more sophisticated, robotic weapons, and much more devastating. And he says, war is no ghost from the past, but it's a constant threat. And he notes that since the Second World War, we seem to have been and there have been constantly wars going on. Now, he does not reject out of hand the traditional just war criteria. What he is distressed about is the just war criteria are continually manipulated to justify recent wars, including undoubtedly the Iraq War, which Pope John Paul II so vigorously opposed, and the appalling consequences are still ongoing from that war. So Francis, he doesn't rule out the need altogether to defend the innocent, of course, against unjust attack. But he wants to maximise the moral pressure about deciding to go for war and avoiding wars of choice that we have been involved in recent times. He writes, in recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly, quote, justified. Some would also wrongly justify even preventive attacks or acts of war. Well, Iraq was one of those, wasn't it, the war in Iraq? These can hardly avoid entailing evils and disorder greater than the evil to be eliminated. We can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably, I emphasize that word probably, always be greater than its supposed benefits. He doesn't say they're always going to be greater, but he says probably. And in view of this, he says, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. And then he adds, never again war. And particularly in this global era, he writes that wars have long and unexpected consequences that end up harming the entire planet and opening the way to new and worse wars in the future. He says we experience a world war fought piecemeal, here and there, breaking out here and there, all over the place. And what he does is that he invites all of us to think of war in personal terms, the personal consequences of war, and to empathise with the victims on all sides. And here's a little quote for you. Every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Let us not remain mired in theoretical discussions, but touch the wounded flesh of the victims. Let us hear the true stories of these victims of violence. Look at reality through their eyes and listen with an open heart to the stories they tell. In this way, we'll be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace. And I can think of not only the victims of war, but we even think of our soldiers returning from war. You know, in the Second World War, all the people who came back trauma to First World War again, traumatized and by the whole experience, terrible experience of war, what it does, and they're the victors of the war. What does it do to those who are conquered, and particularly the innocent, the men, women and children who are killed innocently? And then he fears the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. He rejects deterrence policy as a basis for a lasting peace, words carefully chosen. Here, he quote, the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons both becomes a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. He's also appalled by the waste and corruption involved in the arms trade and pleads that the money spent on arms be used to establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger and favour development in the most impoverished countries, so that citizens do not have to resort to violent or illusory solutions or have to leave their countries in order to seek a more dignified life. So this, again, the idea of a global fund is an idea put forward by Paul VI many years ago. And if only we'd been able to transfer some of the massive funding we put into arms into development efforts, sustained development efforts over those years, what a different world it would be now. But still not too late, he said, we can still do this. A couple of other things he mentions on the death penalty. He's really supported John Paul II again against the use of the death penalty, saying that there can be no stepping back from this position. Today we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. So this is a struggle we had, or a political issue in Australia 40, 50 years ago. And it's still going on in the United States and many countries. And he goes on, he says, particularly serious in this regard is the so-called extrajudicial killing. And we can think of the Philippines, where thousands of people have been killed like this, where homicides are deliberately committed. He wrote that everyone of goodwill is called to work against this and the use of the death penalty, and to improve prison conditions. You look at photos of prison conditions in the Philippines and you're just aghast at this. He considers even life imprisonment as a form of the death penalty. So he's calling us in this section, it's an impassioned section of his writing about, you know, we must avert this trajectory on to greater, wider wars, because it will undermine our whole effort at human uplift.
Thanks, Bruce. Just one last question. The Pope himself could be regarded as a major political actor, but how does he want Catholics and other Christians to become involved in political debates?
Well, he's very much encouraging people to do the normal things about getting informed about particular issues, staying informed, taking your voting rights very conscientiously, forming groups who are prepared to advocate for positions on refugees, on asylum seekers, on the prisons, all the different issues that were promoted. And he wants the church, he says, the church must not, he quotes Pope Benedict on this, we must not remain on the sidelines in this great effort of building a better world. So the whole support for the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all that's involved in there, better healthcare, education, all these things, they're very traditional for us. We've always been doing this, but we need to do that in a more cooperative manner worldwide in this. But he doesn't want religious ministers themselves involved in the party politics, involved in running, and this again, running political parties and being too directly involved in the political processes. And there's good reason for this. We've learned from the past, the history of the church, of where the church gets involved in party politics. It gets very messy. You end up alienating a lot of people, and it's not really good long-term. So with some exceptions, of course, but he says this is properly the role of lay people, to engage in the whole task of social transformation. This is the mission of lay people. This is what, and what the church does is, is to try to help strengthen the moral aspect of the discussion, to help motivate people to be engaged, and to fill them with a sense of mission and meaning, that this is really important. This is the work of human advancement and universal fraternity. And he says, he quoted a number of places, but particularly he quoted a talk he gave in Cuba in 2015, when he said he wants a church to go out from its places of worship, to go out from the sacristies, to build bridges, to break down walls, to sow seeds of reconciliation. So not to remain shut up in churchy things, but to really engage in the social task of human uplift and protecting our planet for the future and coming generations.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for that tremendous in-depth introduction to the encyclical. I'm sure we've got lots of questions, more questions to ask you, but perhaps the best way we can move forward right now would be to ask Danusia Kaska to share a bit about her own experience, which has been working with the St. Vincent de Paul Society, managing soup vans, taking visitors and volunteers to share the experience of homeless and hungry people. Danusia, would you be able to share with us how the encyclical Fratelli Tutti speaks to you, to your own experience, particularly in your role as a social justice animator in a big school?
Yes, thank you very much for that, Stefan. And thank you, Bruce, for your inspiring and comprehensive lecture on Pope Francis' new encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And as you say, it is quite a heavy document and takes some time to digest the 95 pages, but very worthwhile to persevere and to meditate upon, as it has great richness in its message. Just a few words about myself. As Stefan mentioned, I have been involved with the St. Vincent de Paul Society since I was a teenager, and I started up the Young Vinnies in the western parts of Melbourne nearly 30 years ago. I volunteered for many years on different levels of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, including 8 years as the National Vice President of our National Council. I recently managed the soup van operations in Victoria and supported over 1,500 volunteers who feed and support people experiencing homelessness across Victoria in 9 different soup van operations. Now I'm working as a Xavier College Social Justice Network Coordinator, and I manage our social justice events as well as coordinate the volunteers in our 12 partner agencies. I have just completed my course with Bruce Duncan at Yarra Theological Union on Action for a Fairer World, and I have been greatly enriched by it, as well as learning about the wonderful works of Pope Francis. So I can't help but say how blessed I think we are to have such a strong and personable leader of our Catholic Church at this crucial moment, and how much this encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, speaks personally to me. Not only is Pope Francis so in touch with the global issues causing extreme inequality, poverty, injustice, and environmental issues, but he's also not afraid to speak out on them, especially to world leaders on an international level. I feel Pope Francis is the leader we need for our church today to speak so boldly and courageously with great conviction, challenging world leaders and each one of us to take action. So it's my privilege to speak today, and thank you very much, Bruce. It's hard to come after your wonderful lecture. Bruce, you've highlighted some of the issues of injustice and inequality, many born from neoliberal economics and poor social policies, and the crises our world faces, which Pope Francis has discussed in Fratelli Tutti. As you said, this encyclical brings together so many of his recent addresses and reinforces his messaging of the last few years, although without the focus on climate change and sustainability, as in Laudate Si', and also a voice of women in the encyclical. This new encyclical, I believe, will speak to the hearts of young people as much as it will to other generations, as it is written with an authentic simplicity, which people can relate to from all ages and reflect upon. It isn't just an encyclical relying on lots of scientific and academic evidence. Rather, it has a personal, intimate style, inviting one to engage with Pope Francis' words. It is grounded in the values especially important in today's younger generation: fellowship, relationships, creating connections, building community, reaching out to those in need, making a difference, social justice, addressing inequality and unfair structures, religions working together for a united voice, being aware of the needs of the global community, and globalization. These are some of the contemporary issues which I believe people today are very passionate about. Young people are more connected now than ever, and especially in a globalized world. Yet, in our technological age, they are feeling more isolated and lonelier than ever, and they are yearning for a deeper connection and more meaningful relationships. And I witnessed this in the soup vans, where thousands of volunteers are drawn to come and feed the hungry and the homeless. They share in their pain and joys of the broken, the discarded, the destitute. They have an encounter. I see it with the students from schools engaged with ministry to the elderly in nursing homes, tutoring refugees in English, serving meals to people experiencing homelessness. They choose the path of the Good Samaritan, who chooses to see, judge, and act. These people are yearning for a deeper, intimate relationships than modern society can offer, and they find it among each other in their teams of volunteers and with the people they serve. And this is what Pope Francis is calling for: deeper relationships and connection with our neighbours and one another, especially the vulnerable people in need. But it doesn't just stop there. He challenges us to go beyond our boundaries and shores and to view our relationships more globally and in the way we treat our nations, especially developing poorer countries. And Pope Francis calls this social friendship. Many people are drawn to volunteer, especially overseas, especially in the youth, and they witness how the poorest of the poor live without their basic human rights met. They have an encounter, which is what Pope Francis promotes. And he says life is about interaction. He says when we have an encounter and view our neighbours as those also in other countries, especially the poorer countries, then we can't accept poverty and inequality, but we must act. And this is what often happens when these young ones have an overseas encounter or an immersion experience. They are often life-changing for them. To witness how the poorest of the poor live without the basic human rights met, such as lack of sufficient food, clean water, sanitation, a lack of opportunity for education and work, and lack of access to healthcare. And whilst not everyone can engage in such work, we can support programs aimed at addressing these issues and learn more about them. I also witness how younger people are trying to make a difference by the choices they make. Where to buy their clothes from? Are they ethically traded and not made in a sweatshop? Also the diet they have. Being a vegetarian or vegan is very popular these days among young people in order to reduce the suffering of animals as well as their environmental footprint. Their lifestyles, the transport they choose, the work they're drawn to, the peers they choose to support their values. And Pope Francis is very urgent in his appeal in addressing this crisis we are experiencing in our globe, and he invites everyone, Christians and non-Christians alike, to put this as an important priority in our lives, especially in the midst of the global pandemic, where these issues have been exacerbated. This encyclical shows us how we can apply his message to our lives here in Australia. And it all starts with relationships and being in fellowship with each other and the global community. He offers many recommendations, and whilst they are aimed at the higher level changes, we can all learn and participate by the choices we make on the leaders we vote for, the companies we choose to support, the places we buy our clothes from, the food we eat, the information we read, and the issues we discuss among our family and our friends. Personally, since reading this encyclical and also since completing the course of Bruce Duncan this semester, I now often speak against neoliberal economics and the corruption, greed, and power of many multinational companies to my family and friends. I share my disappointment about the slow act to move in the right direction for climate change in Australia, and I discern closely on the leaders I choose to represent me when I vote. Equality, social justice, connection, relationships, sustainability, fellowship, dialogue, empowerment. These are all things that Pope Francis speaks about and that we can aspire to in our world and hope for, so that all of humanity can live their best life. That every person has dignity and can have the same opportunities in life and help everyone to reach their full potential. Pope Francis is asking us all to be advocates on these issues and to keep them as a priority. The Church, both clergy and lay, need to lead by example on these issues, and our schools should be the teachers of them. We need to embrace Fratelli Tutti and be part of making it a living document where there are actions taken and changes made, so that we do see our global community the same as our own family. Pope Francis says we all have a role to play to rediscover our sense of ourselves as one global human family, and then to build a new society out of this COVID-19 pandemic. And this starts in the home with learning about the values that the Good Samaritan displays, and then taking this to the global scale, where we invite all countries to have a voice at the table in making decisions.
Thanks very much, Danusia, for that. Bruce, would you like to respond to Danusia at all? We've got about 3 minutes left of our time slot. And just to conclude.
Yes, thank you very much, Danusia. What I really like about your presentation is that you have such a long experience, such a intense experience really over many years of working with people on the ground and understanding the skills of relating. And I've seen you in various places where you have a great gift of being able to communicate and personally with people, and to even people in very difficult circumstances.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Danusia, how do you think Fratelli Tutti might guide younger people in their faith development?
Yeah, I think that Fratelli Tutti provides practical examples and applications of examples for young people. So it's about putting the faith into action. I think that's what's going to speak strongly to them, where they see, judge and act. And he raised a lot of concerns and issues that young people can learn about and can support. One teacher actually told me after we spoke about Fratelli Tutti that he's now going to revisit the Good Samaritan parable with his classes. And that was something that came to him from reading Fratelli Tutti, because there's so much in there that has been digested and discussed in Fratelli Tutti. I think with schools in the programs of service, that's where they're going to really put their faith into action and make this a real living document. So for example, you've got the young Vinnies, they're out there doing all their works. You've got the Rhema and the Mara schools, Ignatian service in Jesuit schools, volunteering ministry, outreach. They do immersion experiences. They have real experiences with within Australia in Aboriginal remote communities, as well as in overseas communities. And these are causes that young people learn about at school, and they come home and discuss it with their families. I know my nephew did a whole semester on Laudato Si when he was studying in year 11, and he really took that on board and tried to make examples at home where they can make changes. And also, I think Pope Francis really talks to these young people because he knows they're the future leaders, and he's preparing them for the choices they will be making and for the leaders they will be and the world that they're going to build and live in the future. So I think that's why this encyclical is so important, how Pope Francis is speaking to the young people. Sorry.
Thanks, Danusia. Just one last question. How do you think young people, particularly young Catholic men and women, might respond to Fratelli Tutti in their workplaces, in their everyday life, and also to the challenges posed by Pope Francis?
Mm-hmm. I think that this is an excellent encyclical for young people and all people, not only Catholics, but to show how the Pope is speaking out on these issues. So I've been talking to my non-Catholic friends and non-Christian friends about this encyclical, and they're really amazed that Pope Francis, the head of our Catholic Church, is speaking out on these issues. I had no idea about it. So I think that there are everyday discussions that we can have, especially in a post-COVID-19 pandemic world where we are discussing this on a regular basis. So this will become part of everyday discussions, and it's about learning about these issues, advocacy, and then call to actions. People are asking, what can I do to make a difference? And this will help create company policies. For example, where does a company or organisation buy stock from and equipment from? Are they ethically traded companies, moral companies, or are they on the backs of cheap labour from exploiting poorer nations? So workplaces can be places of great dialogue and learning. And also some workplaces become philanthropical. For example, on the soup vans, I used to take out quite a lot of corporate groups and create partnerships with them. And they would not only help with the food and meal service, but they were also then supporting us in buying new equipment, buying new vans, and in advocating for some of these needs. So it is amazing how partnerships can be created from this. And I think it's doing our own bit in our own backyard, which does stay in the workplace, because you can mobilise groups of people to really act and change and have very powerful results. And this can ultimately lead to social policy changes and benefit others, and especially those who are vulnerable and don't have a voice. So I think that workplace can be a really amazing place for this to happen.
Thanks again, Danusia. Actually, it really does sound like there's a lot of ways in which we can do things, practical things in our lives and communities, workplaces, schools. Bruce, I don't know, Father Bruce, do you have any final comments that you'd like to add to this discussion?
I wasn't really expecting, but I think, as Danusia says, we've got to find ways to pick this up and make it practical. And with the with all the things that are bearing down on our world at the moment, we're all caught up in this in some way or another. We're all part of the problem. How to become part of the solution is it's over to us now to work out what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Bruce, and also to Social Policy Connections for your assistance, and also to Danusia and to the Saviour Social Justice Network. It's the first time we've cooperated together to put together such a program, and I hope it won't be the last, and look forward to more things in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, I think that was very good, Danusia. And I think